The Shepnaz podcast begins now.
You're listening to the Shepnaz podcast at Shepherd Church. Everything we do here is to connect our community in a meaningful relationship with Christ, and we're expecting great things. My name's Joey, I'm one of the pastors here, and I get to host this podcast, and today I'm joined by Bryanna, and she is joining us because she was able to preach the word this past Sunday. She serves as our youth director here at Shepherd, and we're excited to have her here to talk about that. So, Bryanna, what's up?
Hey.
If you didn't know, Bryanna has joined full-time here at Shepherd. She came on staff in January as our youth director, and she was working in the school system. And then this summer, as we were kind of figuring out what the next step was, she's come on full-time. We're really excited about what that means for our students, our families, and overall just the health of our church. So we're excited to have you as a part of that. And now, so you'll see her, I think, much more often than you would have before, because she went from like 6 jobs down to, well, she still has 6 jobs. She just gets paid for one. But we're thankful for her. And she's got called preaching, so she was able to preach this weekend. And this summer, Pastor Rob kind of sat us down and asked, like, hey, I want a team preach this summer, and I want you to pick any passage you want. And this passage that Bryanna chose to preach on that she felt God was calling her to is from Mark 14, 3-9. This is what it says. Now the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread were only 2 days away. The chief priests and teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. And while he was in Bethany, reclining at a table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, and the money then given to the poor." They rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor will always be with you, and you can help them anytime that you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could, and she poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare me for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." So, Bryanna, let's talk about this. I'd love to know kind of why did this passage jump out to you as you were kind of studying the book of Mark, saying, I feel like this is what God's called me to preach. What about this passage kind of leapt off the page for you?
Yeah. So for years now, from the time I have read this passage, it's always stood out to me. I just see this woman and this thing that she did by pouring the perfume out on Jesus' feet. And if you look in the Gospel of Luke, it's in all of the Gospels, but in Luke it talks about, wiping his feet with her hair, and it's just such a beautiful act of worship. And so from that regard, it's always been something like a special passage to me. But more specifically, within the last year, I found the Lord just continuously bringing the passage back, and I would just remember it in many just random times. And I feel like he was really preparing me to preach on it before I even knew I would be asked to preach. And so when Rob asked me what passage I'd like to do, this one just instantly came to mind. So it's been really cool how the Lord has been preparing my heart for this message long before, like I said, I even knew I would be asked.
And so the central theme of the passage, as you brought to the congregation, was really like, what does it look like to worship, right? So can you talk about this passage and how it relates to our act of worship, how we kind of interact with God, how she interacted with Jesus, and how we can learn from that?
Yeah. So as I was preparing this message, and we can see in the verse, it's really a costly act of worship, and this idea of costly worship and what that looks like in our lives. And so for her, it was, taking this jar of perfume that was very expensive. And not only that, there have been Bible scholars and people that believe that it was a family heirloom. So not only did it have, from a financial standpoint, it was expensive, but it held significant value and could have been passed down for many generations. So this priceless, thing that she literally just poured it on the feet of Jesus, and as an act of true worship and her adoration for him. And so looking in our lives and the way that we worship, the theme of costly worship came to mind. And like I said, and the thing that I feel like the Lord really brought to my attention as we talked about on Sunday is worship in the hard times. And I feel like that is a true cost, because there are times when, life is hard and we go through storms, and it is hard to worship. It's hard to thank God for the things that we go through. Sometimes, we might even ask ourselves, is God good? Is it like, why would he allow this to happen? And so being able to still worship in those times and bring a sacrifice of praise, like true worship is a sacrifice, and just trusting God, even when life is not going how we think it should, or even in the seasons where it's great, sometimes it's hard to praise, or, we get into the habit of kind of living on autopilot. We do things in our own strength, and we think that things are going well because, we're just doing all the right things. And sometimes we forget to really point it back to him. And really our life, like, we have been created to worship him in all that we do. And so I just wanted to explore this idea of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, how we can really live our lives in a state of worship. So,
you and I, we actually did a few podcasts about it, but we went to NYC, and one of the pastors that preached, he talked about worship briefly in his message. He talked about what it looked like how do you know when it's true worship, right? And I think one of the things that when we work with teenagers, we try to help them understand that there will be times where you can feel, the presence of God, or, the emotional state, you can feel it. But he said, when it's true worship, when you don't feel it anymore and you keep showing up, you keep pressing in, even when that feeling has come and gone, you keep pushing for what is there. And I think that's an important thing. I wonder, when you talk about costly worship, I wonder if that's hard in our culture to understand. Because for many of us, following Jesus hasn't cost us in very many ways. Does that play into anything with us in our culture, as you're teaching this to us in Central Ohio and whoever's watching online, but does that play into it at all? The cost, like you talk about what she did really cost her. And I think about in my life, I don't know how often it's really costed me to do something. Yeah.
And that, in this regard, when I was preparing the sermon, when I could think about it, it was mostly like what is hardest for us when we worship. But it is true. We don't experience a lot of times when the worship is costly. I mean, we are privileged. We're blessed to be able to attend service on Sundays. Like we have the choice to do that. And in a lot of parts of the world, that's not available. So it is a real thing. I think in that regard, like I said, just looking in the areas of our lives when life is hard, and it does feel like a sacrifice, or we are, pushing through the pain. But it is a very real thing. Like you bring up, like it costs so much more in other places when there's literal lives at stake for worshiping. So it's a real thing.
So, you had kind of a few points towards the end of your sermon. I'd love to just kind of run through them and kind of recap kind of what worship does in our life. And one of them was that worship may not change our circumstances, but it can take our eyes off the storm. Talk about that, and what does that do in our life? We take our eyes off our storm. Where do our eyes then go?
Yeah. So when we worship, we are basically declaring, like, I'm trusting God no matter what. I'm loving God no matter what. Even though like things are falling apart, I'm choosing to believe that he is still good. He's still God. He has it all under control. And when we remind ourselves of that, it doesn't change our circumstances. It doesn't change necessarily what we're going through in that moment, but it allows us to not give into fear, the lies of the enemy, or to spiral. And I'm so guilty of this when if something, I'm going through a hard time or things are stressful, it's easy to like just give into the stress and anxiety and believe, the enemy's always going to be there telling us lies about, especially in situations that are really difficult, of like, God's not going to help you, or, you're on your own, or you'll never get out of this. Like, this is forever, things like that. And so being able to combat those lies with truth, and worship does that. And even just in the songs that we sing, and worship goes beyond just singing on a Sunday morning,
right?
But, especially worship songs, like they all, for the most part, have truth. And, you're speaking these words over your life in these situations, and praising him, and bringing him glory. And it reminds ourselves that, like I said, even if the things around us aren't good, he is still good. And even if he allows us to go through hardship, it doesn't change who he is and how he is a good God. So,
are you looking for a fun and meaningful way to spend your Friday night? Then join the Shepherd family at Huntington Park for Faith Night on Friday, September 8th. Watch the Columbus Clippers take on the Scranton Rail Riders. Don't miss this opportunity to celebrate your faith and cheer on your team. Tickets are $10 per person. To order your tickets, visit shepnaz.org/Clippers.
And then you talked about how another thing that happens is that people can see our worship. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the verse that we shared in Acts in reference to this. It's Acts 16, verses 23 through 25. It says, after they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. So kind of looking on the last part, the other prisoners were listening to them. So we have this scene that, Paul and Silas were in prison, and they are still choosing to worship. And, that can be reflected in our own lives of how, we just live our lives, how we treat others, how we respond in hard situations. And something that came to mind and that I share is like how when we're really stressed out, or, how easy it is to kind of take it out on the people around us, or maybe things are really, really hard, and, but choosing to love the people that are in our lives. And, how often people see us, especially like families, parents with kids. Your kids are always watching you. And so in those hard times, are you still choosing to be faithful to God? Are you still loving, and not lashing out on people, or, whatever that looks like? But people see, especially when we go through trials in life, the people around us that know we're walking through them. I think sometimes we can be put on a pedestal in a way, like the people around us kind of watch us a little bit closer, and they like, oh, they're going through this. And so they know that. And so often you hear about people like going through the hardest of times, like people dying of cancer and things like that. And it's like, how are you so joyful? Like, how can you be so okay, but you're going through this? And, the source of their joy is the Lord, and they choose to worship. They still choose to honor him with their lives. And so that's a huge thing. And people are watching us more than we realize. And so it's important that we are still honoring God through everything in the highs and lows of life. So
let's talk a little bit more about the practical stuff then. So all of this worship should cost something. It's going to cost us something.
Yeah.
That it helps us to focus on him. It, it's a witness to other people. But then, so how do we do it? And I think you kind of touched on it a little bit. I think we sometimes equate music with worship. And though music is a big part of worship, and it's all through scripture, like when God's people gather, they sing. Like it's the reason we sing in church is because God's people have done that. And it's really commanded. But what does it look like to live a life of worship if we're saying it's not just about Sunday morning singing songs or, that stuff. So what, how do people then kind of act on this? What are some ways that they can live this out?
Yeah. So, I think worship can be so overcomplicated. Really, worship, what it is just bringing glory and honor to God through our lives and everything that we do, living in an act of surrender. So surrendering every area of our life, like waking up every day saying, I'm going to choose to honor you. I'm choosing to follow you. I'm choosing to worship you. In so many ways that you can do that. These are just practical ways, but like we said, singing and praise, like you can praise and sing to the Lord in other ways other than just on a Sunday morning. Like you can worship him in your car. There's incredible worship songs and artists that are putting out music daily that you can listen to on your drive, or it doesn't even have to be a song. Like you can sit and it doesn't matter if you're a singer or not. You can sit at your house and just sing out what you are feeling in that moment and praising. But you can also just do it by prayer and thanksgiving, waking up every day, thanking the Lord for everything he's given you. There's sometimes a tendency when we go to God in prayer of asking him for things and then going through a whole list without ever really thanking him. And so something that I've started doing is being intentional when I start prayer by just thanking God and not even getting to and sometimes I'll go to prayer with a list of things I want to ask for, and I don't even ask for them because I've just spent all this time thanking him. And it changes our hearts when we do that. The next is reading the word, spending time. I mean, this is his written word, like him speaking to us through scripture. And so just spending time with him by reading his word and applying it to our lives and honoring him through that. Fellowship, loving others, spending time in community, loving them with the love of Christ. And then the last thing is just surrender. Like I said, living a life of constant surrender. And the ways that you can apply this is just by choosing every day, like I said, to honor him in everything. And when you're washing the dishes or, just like doing random things of just Thanksgiving throughout the day and just being mindful of him in everything that you're doing.
Yeah.
So.
You say washing the dishes, and this is just a plug for something that it's easy to think that you have to do these grandiose things, right? But if you struggle with, well, my life doesn't have that sort of significance, or I don't have that significant of a job, I would encourage you to read a book by Brother Lawrence called Practicing the Presence of God, where he literally talks about how his job in the monastery was to wash the dishes and that he was going to do it in worship to God. And so everything, like you said, everything we do, if put in the right mindset, is that act of worship. Yeah. There should be no piece of our life that wouldn't be, because then it would make the other pieces harder to be that. So is there anything, as we kind of wrap that up then, like is it something you want anybody to take away from that, kind of like just the final thought?
Yeah. With anything in life, we don't have to do it on our own. And, going back to where I said, choosing every day to do it. Just pray about it. Be like, God, I want to worship you. I want to honor you, but in my own strength, it's not easy. I can't do it. So like, help me, or ask the Lord to remind you, and set up reminders for yourself. Like, remind on your phone, like praise him today, or, even just having like a sticky note on your mirror when you're getting ready in the morning, or whatever that looks like, to remind you. And then just spending time in his presence. It's hard to worship somebody that we don't know. So if you are listening to this and you're still learning about God, you're still figuring this out, I encourage you just to spend time with him on a daily basis. And the more we get to know who he is, the more we love him, the more we spend time reading his word, we learn about him. And it's easier to love him, when you do know who he is and his character. So take time, if you are still figuring it out, to really get to know him. And
Good stuff. All right, well, that's going to wrap up our episode today. My thanks to Bryanna for jumping in and being a part of this, and for her message this past week. We're thankful for you for paying attention to this and jumping in. We want you to subscribe, share this with your friends. If you have any questions, you want to get a hold of us, you can. podcast@shepnaz.org. That's our email. As always, you can keep up what's happening at Shepherd through our website, social media pages, of course, on the app. If you have any questions, let us know. For Pastor Bryanna, I'm Joey. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.